Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptation. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we are going to break down episode 5 of Heated Rivalry, one of my favorite episodes of television of not only 2025, but possibly of all time. And I don't say that lightly. This episode broke me. I cried, I sat in silence, then I somehow revived my faith in television and long-form storytelling, because when it's done with care and intention and trust in the writing and the characters, beautiful, amazing things like this can happen. More than anything, I think episode 5 earns its place because every choice and every story beat that was set up earlier on in this series lands perfectly here. And we are positioned for the finale with so much excitement, and our emotions are totally shot, but it's exactly where the story needs us to be. I talk plenty in the breakdown, so let's not waste any more time. Let's talk about episode 5. I absolutely love the way we open episode 5 of Heated Rivalry with Shane and Rose in his house, because it gives so much insight into Shane and what he's thinking in the aftermath of the club scene. This scene would be the next morning after they had slept together the night of the club scene, and we know that Shane had a very difficult time getting there with Rose and had to think about Ilya in order to do so. I also think these shots are important because we see how when he wakes up to her, his reaction isn't as excited or happy as what we will see in the finale of the episode when he wakes up with Ilya. Shane tries to justify his performance by saying that the season is stressing him out more than he realized. And Rose prompts him with dinner to try and reconnect with one another. What makes this scene so impactful is that after Shane sees Ilya in the nightclub and knows that he has feelings, he doesn't immediately end things with Rose. He continues to date her. And this is an emotional through line we see with Shane throughout the series. He's choosing to be with Rose not over Ilya. He's choosing to be with Rose so that he doesn't have to choose, because Rose is normal and safe, and it allows him to not question if wanting Ilya is wrong. The music that plays over the scene here is going to be another music callback, and we see Shane reading through comments and again trying to justify that what he's doing dating Rose is what's normal and what should be right. The whole world agrees that they look great together. The irony is that Ilya is reading through the comments and mad that they look so great together, because in the club scene, Ilya has realized that somewhere deep in his brain, his feelings for Shane are feelings he's never felt for anyone before. And I love that the show uses him scrolling through his phone and keeping tabs on them as a way to convey his obsession about it. Ilya ended up leaving the nightclub, and his teammate Marlo thinks that it's because he went and hooked up with the girl he was dancing with, but in reality, he went home alone and thought about Shane the whole night. I love the use of the word beautician here. It's such a hockey term. Then we get a voiceover from the Man in the Crease podcast, and we can see that Shane is listening to it while rowing on the rowing machine, and they're mentioning the upcoming All-Star game in Tampa, and it will be the first time that Shane and Ilya are playing together on the same team. They mention who will center who, and both Shane and Ilya play center, which is foreshadowing to the conversation Ilya will have with Svetlana about Shane centering him. They also mention Scott Hunter again, just to bring him back to the forefront of our mind, because we will see him, as we know, at the end of this episode. They're also so mean to Scott. He is the captain of the USA hockey team and the captain of the Admirals, but it makes the ending of the episode that much sweeter when you know that he overcame all of this negative press. So within a few short minutes, we know everyone who's going to be in this episode and exactly where they're at. I don't think it's too dramatic to say that this conversation between Shane and Rose at the beginning of episode 5 is one of the most important moments in the entire series. And the show's additions make the subtext from the books that much clearer without changing the core meaning of this scene. In the book, Shane reflects on his time with Rose as being genuinely nice. She is easy for him to talk to, very kind, interested in people, very observant, remembers every detail. Little does Shane realize that she had been doing the same thing on him. He describes the times that they had slept together as fine, better than usual really. So by the time Rose and Shane sit down at this bar, Shane's aware that she's sort of onto him having difficulty performing. Shane continuing to date Rose after the club scene makes total sense for him. Ilya realizes he has feelings for Shane in the aftermath of that club scene, but Shane doesn't want to confront them. So instead of choosing Rose over Ilya, he doesn't choose. He just continues doing the easy, safe thing, which is dating her. If you look back on Rose as a character, you can pinpoint the times when she started to piece together the information she's been provided and get a little bit of insight into the fact that Shane may be not interested in her. That's because she's observant. She asks him questions, and she's not invested in preserving Shane's denial of how he feels, which is why this conversation isn't confrontational for her. So at first, she brings up Miles because that seems like the easiest point of entry for her to start this conversation. And everybody who watched episode 4 knows that Miles was laying it on very thick with Shane, so it makes him lying about not realizing that he was gay that more obvious. When she gets more candid and asks Shane if there are any openly gay hockey players. In the book, Shane thinks to himself, why is she asking me about this? And internally, Shane starts to panic. He starts noticing that she's smiling and he doesn't understand why. And Hudson does an incredible job conveying that fear on his face. She's not suspicious. She's more so just pointing out that she's aware of the system that he is trapped in. And when Rose realizes that Shane can talk about queerness in the abstract but not talk about himself, she pivots. In the book, Shane says it feels like he was staring down a slap shot and he braced himself for impact. And Rose does such a good job making sure that her questions aren't aggressive. They're more so just observant. When she grabs his hand, it's another way for her to reassure him that she's not interrogating him. She's just trying to help him with giving him an out. So when she follows up by saying, I really like you, she means that because that is true regardless of his attraction. When she says, you like talking to me, and Shane agrees, but then she says, do you like kissing me? And he says, sure. That's when she gets to the truth of everything, because Shane can't contradict that honestly, and he doesn't, but he hesitates, and that is a confession that in his head realizes makes him exposed. But Rose doesn't say it as though she's upset that Shane doesn't like her. It's more of her simply stating a fact that she knows Shane doesn't like her in that way. And in the book, Shane notes that this is the first time he's ever encountered a direct accusation like this before. But then he reframes and notices that she's not accusing him or judging him. She was just trying to understand him. The way that the music changes when Rose finally comes right out and says, I feel like you would rather be kissing Miles instead of me, is so beautiful because we are now entering into Shane's mind. We are going to focus on Shane and how Shane is feeling for the duration of this scene. The music is cluing us into that. The line where Shane says, I know the sex stuff is a problem, is also really important because Rose points out something really pivotal, which is that a problem is something that you can fix. This comes up in Shane's brain again in the finale when Ilya uses the word problem to describe him. Yes, Shane is right in assuming that this would be a problem for them. Rose is just brave enough to tell him that it's not one that can be solved because they are not compatible. Rose is very much here to be a mirror to Shane. She doesn't push him. She doesn't demand anything of him. She doesn't position herself as a victim. And because she fosters that environment for Shane, he is able to open up and really confront a lot of truths about himself that we have watched him ignore for years. She is simply offering him friendship and safety, and so she becomes the first person that Shane can talk to honestly because he knows that there are no consequences. He's able to speak openly and be understood and not punished for it. When Rose starts to ask Shane questions like if he's ever been with another guy, the use of flashbacks is so critical here because the answer is Ilya. Have you been with another guy? Ilya. There's no abstract here. It's only one person. That's why the memory is so specific. The way that Hudson Williams plays this scene and how his eyes are welling up with tears, you can feel the weight of how isolated he has been, not being able to talk about his feelings like this to anyone for years, which again is only made possible by Rose genuinely caring about Shane, being curious about him, and wanting to create that safe environment. When she asks, was it different with a guy, we get one of the most tender moments that we've witnessed between Shane and Ilya in the staircase. And Shane finally admits to himself, of course it was different. And I'm so glad that Rose made him admit that different is better here, because Shane has only ever associated different as being wrong or bad. This clip is actually different from the one that we get in the actual episode, which to me, I made a video on this separately, is his memory being different than what we, the viewer, get to see in the show. For him to say the words out loud, yeah, it was better, is monumental. And mere seconds after making that admission, he blows through years of personal development and shares something so deeply personal as, I prefer to be the whole, which again is only made possible by Rose making Shane feel seen. He has gone out of his way for years making sure nobody sees the truth of him. And as soon as he's given a runway, he just blows past any of the awkwardness, because these are all things he's worked out in his mind while he was hiding the truth about himself. And Rose, again, fosters that safe space for him by relating it back to her profession, by normalizing it and recontextualizing what that means to be interested in men. Because again, Shane is so limited by his experiences in the world of hockey that he doesn't know what it's like on the outside. When she suggests that Shane follow Miles back on Instagram, he shuts it down pretty quickly, because we all know it's only Ilya for him. Ilya isn't in this scene, but he is in every single answer that Shane gave to Rose. She is the first person that asks him questions so pointed that he can't lie through them. And when he answers them honestly, because she fostered a safe space for him to do so, all of those answers lead back to his love for Ilya. You'll also notice that at this point in this scene, the music kind of shifts again. It's a little more lighter, upbeat. And Shane asks her, you haven't said anything to Miles about me, have you? Because for Shane, his whole mantra is that no one can know, or it literally will feel like the sky is going to fall. For him to talk to someone so candidly about himself like Rose and then be reassured that the sky is not going to fall is a really pivotal moment for Shane, because now the gap that was between his own self-realization and revealing it to someone has closed, and it's with someone that Shane as a baseline really likes and trusts and enjoys spending time with and talking to. I love the lighting in this shot here, because again, that kind of orangey red and blue color that we see all throughout the show is highlighted, and as the camera kind of slowly pans over to Shane and Rose talking, they are surrounded by that red colorway, which we now associate with warmth and comfort and safety. And I love watching Shane's body language here, because he is still wound so tight. He still has his thumbs hooked in his pant pockets, but his whole world just shifted beneath his very feet. I love that she also points out that there's probably not a lot of people that he can talk to, because she just found out that he's never spoken to this about anyone before. And the line "things and stuff can be tricky for me" is so great at pointing out that these things have been abstract for him, so he hasn't labeled them with a real word. When she runs away, I love looking at Shane's face here too, because he is out in public. The two of them are very publicly dating, and there are people walking down the sidewalk, so he waves to her and then very quickly tries to be unassuming, look away so they don't see who he is, but he has a little smile because his whole world just changed. On the same night that Shane and Rose have their conversation at the bar, Ilya and Svetlana are having an important conversation themselves back in Boston. This scene in the book opens up with Ilya saying that Svetlana was his favorite, and one of the reasons why is because she had blue eyes, long blonde hair, and looked nothing like Shane. That's just one of the many differences between book Svetlana and the show version, and all of the show changes to her character make this scene so much more impactful. In the show, the smoking detail is important because it implies that Ilya is reverting to old habits now that Shane and him are not speaking, and those habits are not making his pain go away. It's also important to know that Svetlana has noticed that his behavior is changing. In the book, her character is almost explicitly sexual, and there's definitely a friendship and appreciation for her there, but it's not very deep. In the show, she's very important because she's representative of Ilya's past. She knew him before the NHL persona, and she knows him outside of that persona. With her, he is emotionally safe, and she's not impressed by him or dependent on him. And she speaks Russian, so he's really able to be himself in front of her. That's why she can tease him without worrying about his reaction, and why she notices changes in him so easily. In the book, if she was prying this way, it might be seen as her being jealous, but in the show, it's more a genuine curiosity. And for Ilya, her being curious about what's going on with him is more dangerous than if she was just jealous. In the book, Ilya has only known her for about 3 years. She works at a Lamborghini dealership in Boston, and Ilya actually has a lot of really nice cars in the book. She's also the daughter of a retired Boston player. In the show, she's a childhood friend. Her father was a Russian goaltender, but they also lean into what the book touches on, which is that she has incredible hockey knowledge. This scene made me want to have her meet Matheson in season 2 because she spends the whole time talking shit about him. We've already seen her confront Ilya about whether or not he's been seeing anyone recently. In the book, this passage actually reveals so much about how Ilya is feeling, because as soon as Svetlana brings up Shane, his mind starts racing. In the book, Svetlana asks if they're going to sleep together again, and Ilya actually turns her down and thinks to himself that he would never turn Shane down if he was here. He actually says to himself that no one sets him on fire like Shane Hollander, that all the women he sleeps with are fun and beautiful, but he doesn't think about them after they're gone. He doesn't long for them. He knows that Shane's not really an option, but he's scared by how desperately he wants to continue their relationship, but not enough to embarrass himself by reaching out to Shane. In the book, he had just played Shane last week, and he didn't reach out to him. He also says that he would have liked to not watch Rose and Shane in the nightclub together, but fate seemed determined to rub Shane in his face. Svetlana bringing Shane up in this moment is really important because she's starting to circle around Shane, bringing up his looks and his skating. She's testing Ilya, especially when she says he's gorgeous. And Ilya touches his nose, which is a physical tell of his, and it betrays him instantly and confirms what he won't say out loud. He's trying to stay neutral by not agreeing with her, but it's because he's afraid that she's too close to knowing the truth. That fear has convinced him that if he were to agree that Shane is gorgeous, he'd have to elaborate on why that's significant or why he feels that way. There's no way for us to know if Ilya himself has told Svetlana that he is bisexual, but it's safe to assume he has not. So this scene works to show us that she has figured that out on her own without him having to say it. When she says she'd love to see Shane and Ilya play on a line together at the All-Star game, it's not subtle. And Ilya's knee-jerk reaction is that's not possible because they both play center. But Svetlana knows that Ilya can play wing. And yes, I think the bisexual subtext is absolutely intentional here. And you can see with her side eye that she's looking for a reaction. Ilya having this sort of mock offense is very much an avoidance tactic that we've seen him use time and time again to deflect. He does this when something is too close to the truth. He uses humor because it's safer than being honest. Seeing him be playful with her in the bed like this is also a really important narrative and visual callback to what we will see in the cottage episode when he and Shane are able to be like this together alone. Svetlana really is the closest thing he has to family up until this point. She provides him with so much emotional safety, and this is the first of 2 conversations in this episode that she really moves the needle with him. Having him lay on her lap like this is also a really great visual callback when we see him doing this in Shane's lap in the cottage episode 2. When Svetlana mentions Rose Landry, that's sort of like the gut punch for Ilya. She also brings up her clothes, which is foreshadowing to Shane getting a stylist. And as soon as she mentions Rose, you can tell that the tone has shifted for Ilya. In the books, he wonders if Rose will be joining Shane at the All-Star game, and if she'd be coming to everything that Shane went to from now on. He even lets himself think about maybe they would get married, because for the first time ever, he's not excited to be going to an all-star game. And the nerves of seeing each other again are at play for both Shane and Ilya in the bar scene. Both Shane and Ilya enter the all-star game bar scene in two very different headspaces. In the books, the passage opens with, "The past few weeks had been the first time that Ilya felt sure that if he texted him, Shane wouldn't reply. Shane would probably show the text to his movie star girlfriend, and they would laugh about how pathetic Ilya was." So Ilya goes into this scene assuming that Shane has moved on, which is why his body is so unsettled. He's nervously scanning the bar, touching his ears and his hair, checking over his shoulder. These are all the same anxious, self-soothing things we saw on the couch in episode 4. And that parallel matters because we now know this is unguarded Ilya. Shane enters the bar having just gotten over a huge mental hurdle. And in the book, he says he wanted to see Rozanov this weekend. He wanted to be with him. He was tired of lying to himself about it. Ilya whispers to himself, "Okay here," and then chugs the rest of his beer as if to say, "Get it together." He's bracing for impact in this moment. And in the book, he has to order another drink to stop himself from staring at Shane. And he feels like an idiot in his shirt, curses himself for feeling so gloomy about this weekend when it should be happy, and he avoids eye contact. He only looks at Shane when Shane isn't looking, and he only looks at him quickly. Ilya mentioning the ginger ale right away is him signaling to Shane, "I remember what you like, and you're not ordering what you normally would," which are both indirect ways of him saying, "I know you." Shane then replying saying that he's feeling a bit wild is a playful comeback, but it's also true because he is feeling a bit wild. He's never been more free than he is in this moment, and it's his way of trying to engage with Ilya, but Ilya is still closed off, something that Shane clocks immediately. You'll notice Ilya never stops moving in this entire scene. He's rubbing his fingers on his beer bottle, bouncing his knee. Shane's really just testing to see whether the door is still open, but he doesn't know that Ilya has been suffering. He only knows that right now their normal banter isn't there between them, which is why he starts throwing out safer topics like the fact that they're in Florida and that the venue is nice and that the game should be fun. He's never going to come out and say it, but he's basically asking, "Are you mad at me?" Ilya avoiding eye contact is very much self-protection. He's trying to manage his pain. And you can see in this shot, Shane's aware of it and it bothers him. It isn't until after the two of them get their beers and they take big gulps that they have their first breakthrough because they're mirroring each other's nerves, but they both have different reasons for being nervous. Ilya finally asking, "Did you bring anyone?" is where the book and the show align perfectly because it's a risk. He knows that this is a risky question, but he's desperate to know, terrified to know actually, because at the heart of it, he wants to know, "Please tell me if I need to move on." But Shane's oblivious, so he gives a very practical answer about his parents and that they're not there because they're going to Mexico. He doesn't think that this might be Ilya being jealous until he realizes mid-sentence that that might be what Ilya is getting at. The moment Ilya says, it makes Shane recalibrate and ask Ilya the same question back, which is huge for Shane because he's pursuing a feeling and asking follow-up questions, something he normally doesn't do. Ilya replying nope and popping the pea and taking a deliberate sip of his beer and maintaining direct eye contact is really loaded. Definitely not casual. It's him saying, "I'm here, I'm alone, I want you to know that." And Shane's reaction of having to look away and smiling mirrors Ilya's avoidance earlier. They're kind of trading roles now. They're kind of cautiously flirting with one another, and Ilya starts to look at him more openly and suggestively here. And Shane finally feels like their dynamic is back, so he starts to participate in being flirty too and compliments Ilya on his shirt. They're both now on the same page that their conversation has become flirtatious. In the book, Ilya thinks he probably could have said something similar, but he was too busy staring at the hollow of Shane's throat. Shane licks his lips here, and again, that's his desire breaking through his nerves, and they're back in the rhythm, except for before, their flirting was safe because neither of them believed it meant anything. But now Shane knows what he wants, and Ilya is also afraid of losing Shane, and that makes it more charged. Carter Vaughn crashing this moment does two things because it reminds us that they're rivals in public, cats and dogs, but it also highlights how intimate their bubble had just become. Ilya's eyes widening and his eyebrows lifting when Carter jokes about not trusting him is directed solely at Shane, and then him saying that he'll order him a black coffee. It's Ilya not wanting Carter to be drunk or notice too much. The music also changes once Carter walks away to a song called Boys Will Be Girls. Go read the lyrics. This shot here of us looking at them face on with Shane on the left and Ilya on the right is again foreshadowing to the positioning we'll see them in episode 6. When Ilya says it should give us a chance to get to know each other, who knows what we might have in common, it's full of innuendo. And again, throughout this entire scene, Ilya is jittering in his chair. He looks him up and down, he holds his stare, and then they fall into a quiet, and Shane breaks eye contact because he's overwhelmed and flustered right now by Ilya, and that's exactly the kind of reaction Ilya always wants out of him. So he has to look away from him again and take another sip of his beer. And that's when Ilya says, "You're looking very pretty today," and reclaiming the word pretty from episode 1, something that Shane always felt like was a joke, but now we realize that Ilya never meant it that way, and Shane can actually hear it as a compliment. When Shane confesses to hiring a personal stylist, this is when the momentum of the scene shifts, because in the book, Ilya fully believes Shane is about to say, "I'm seeing someone, I'm engaged, I don't need you anymore." He is panicking internally the entire time, waiting for Shane to deliver whatever news he's going to say to him. And you can see him attempt to put on this sort of blasé look on his face. I think the best physical cue is that Connor has Ilya shrug and look away from him before he says sure, so he's lying. But instead of bad news, Shane says, "I hired a personal stylist," and Ilya's reaction is so unguarded because he's both relieved that Shane didn't say those things, but also because he understands the implications of it. His reaction is so pure, unguarded, joyful. His eyebrow twitches at one point. You can feel how relieved he is, and he has to cover his mouth and look away because the undertone of this isn't about Rose. Me looking different and putting effort in and doing something myself isn't about Rose. But it also opens the door for Ilya to recognize that this thing with Shane isn't completely sealed off from him. I also think it's nice that this scene kind of lets there be more elaboration on Shane wanting to be viewed differently now because he feels differently in his own body, and he's come to a very real conclusion about who he is, and outwardly he would want to reflect that better. Ilya saying, "I know what you wore," is another way of him saying, "I know you," and then Shane saying, "not you," is another way where he singles out that Ilya is different for him. He doesn't lump him in with all the other guys in the league. He's different. Ilya continues to be so incredibly jittery in this scene because he still hasn't come right out and asked the question he really wants the answer to, which is, does this have anything to do with Rose Landry? He's trying, but failing to put a mask back on because he's unsure of the answer, so his face here is very smug again. I also love that the timing of him asking this question is during the bridge of the song playing in the background when the tempo slows down. Ilya avoids eye contact until he says her name, and then he basically forces himself to hold it. I love that Ilya's eyebrows raise the moment Shane says that she dressed well because he's jealous, and then he has to look away, but in the books he catches on pretty quick that Shane's speaking in the past tense. But then again, out of almost desperation, he has to ask a clarifying question, which is, so you and her are not... Because for his own mental sanity, he doesn't want there to be any question of whether or not Shane is dating Rose. By the time Shane says, "She's great, we're just not compatible," that's quite literally one of the bravest things he can do right now because he's telling the truth without saying why. But the subtext of all of it is, I'm compatible with you. That's why I'm not with Rose. The music shifts again to signal that the conversation and the relationship dynamic has changed, and Ilya understands it, even though Shane doesn't say it out loud. He starts doing the triangle gaze, so he looks left eye, right eye, mouth, which is deliberate and very intimate. And he is still jittery here. He's rubbing his thumb on the table. He's always moving in this entire scene. His body is ahead of his brain. He believes Shane, but he's trying not to overreact, so he, instead of using words, just says, When the camera cuts back to a wide angle, it's because we're ending that intimate moment. And Ilya is still looking at Shane pretty longingly, but Shane aborts because he knows that that moment was very charged, and if he stays there any longer, something will happen. But it's not in rejection of Ilya. It's kind of out of self-regulation. There's a lot going on in his head. He just admitted he's not with Rose anymore. He felt Ilya's attention back on him. He has this very obvious desire for him that he now knows he cannot hide. So when he says, I should circulate, I guess, Ilya follows it up with another joke, because unlike in the tuna melt scene, Ilya knows that he's not leaving because he's rejecting him. Shane choosing to slide out of the chair on the side closest to Ilya is not accidental, and neither is Ilya sitting back in his chair hoping that Shane might brush against him as he passes him. He also takes a big exhale there, and I think that shows he's okay with how that went. He's thinking it went better than expected. He's not running away from him like he did in the tuna melt scene. When he's alone, his mask drops and he has to cover his mouth to hide him smiling to himself. He can't really hide how he feels anymore. And in the books, he describes it as a ridiculous smile. It's almost like he's telling himself, no, I didn't imagine that. I didn't lose Shane. Whatever we have together is not over. I also love how golden the light in this scene is, because historically we only ever see them together at night or in shadow or in private, but this scene is just bathed in this like warm glow, which carries over into the pool scene and out onto the ice, and so does the song that's playing in the background. So even though they leave the bar separately, they're both on the same kind of emotional footing now. They aligned during this scene. They both know that they want the other person. It's just less about them choosing each other, more so them both realizing that they had already chosen each other without realizing it, and now the idea of it going away is too scary for both of them to ignore. Stretch of scenes that takes place after the All-Star Game bar scene is actually one of my favorite visual metaphors of the entire show, and it's one that's so subtle you probably wouldn't notice it if you weren't paying close attention. At the hotel pool, both us as the viewers and Shane are not participating in the scene. We're watching it. Shane is watching from behind sunglasses, and he has an internal thought here of whether or not Ilya ever thought about having kids because he was so good with them. What's important in the books that the show can't really contextualize is that Shane doesn't follow that thought up with anything sexual. It's purely an observation of him watching Ilya in a domestic setting for the first time, because this is the first time Shane has ever allowed himself to think of Ilya outside the setting of hockey, which is a great metaphor when you intercut it with the All-Star Game shots here. It's also a great way for us as viewers to see that this is how Ilya is outside of the persona in hockey. He is funny and playful and kind. Shane has only gotten glimpses of that throughout the series, so now he's getting it full on. And it's only through this scene that Shane gets a sense of what a domestic partnership with Ilya would look like, while the scenes of them skating together represent them very much in a flow state with one another. In the books, Ilya says they barely had any time to practice together, but it was like they were reading each other's minds. This is the first time that we see their relationship have very little friction within it. Ilya is making fun of Shane, and instead of having some sort of a jab back, he just laughs. There isn't a power struggle in any of these comments that Ilya makes. Shane is just very much responding to Ilya. And when Ilya asks Shane to make sure the kids don't cheat, he is placing Shane in a partner role in the activity, but there's also the undertone of life partner as well. This All-Star Game is also the first time in their careers that Shane and Ilya are put on the same team and therefore not pitted up against each other as rivals. And so we get to see when that obstacle is removed and the rivalry isn't there, what their partnership actually looks like. As someone who played hockey, I can tell you that this flow state is really a very real thing. And that's doubled down by the fact that Ilya chose to play wing and let Shane play center. Ilya counting down the kids over the hockey play is also intentional because it shows Ilya existing in both spaces, and we get to witness Shane just enjoying him in this new environment that he's not used to. And again, I think that's a great metaphor of as soon as you remove the pressure and weight of their rivalry from this experience of this weekend, the two of them are able to relax and enjoy it in such a different way. Now, there's a few things that I noticed as a hockey player earlier on in the series that come back up in this particular scene that I think are really kind of cool, and that is the hockey tape. I noticed in episode 1 that Shane used black tape and Ilya used white tape, just because that's something that I look at anyway. And you can see that if you follow along here. Shane enters the zone, leaves a drop pass for Ilya. He pivots and opens up along the boards, and Ilya just knows where to feed the puck. They've spent their whole careers thinking that they are perfect rivals, and in this moment you realize that they actually are each other's perfect counterbalance in hockey. To me, that sort of black and white stick tape is sort of the yin and yang of them. It's just a way to visually represent that they're two sides of the same coin, and they actually work better together than when you pit them against one another, which is what's going on in their personal lives too, when they're realizing they're better together than fighting against it. It's another reason why I love that in this shot we see Shane celebrating and happy and then clapping and happy, so that these two things can be seen as existing outside of hockey and on the ice. And them playing on a team together in this way and being so successful is also foreshadowing for what will happen in season 2. Ilya kisses him in this moment because in the books he says he had an opportunity and he took it. And it's a huge emotional risk for Ilya in some ways, but Shane laughs instead of rejecting it. And that goes a really long way in showcasing that they are moving further ahead in their acceptance of their attraction and really love of each other. Shane tries to be macho for a second and you can see his masking go back on, but then he ends up smiling again. Then we also see that Ilya is now creating and choosing to create intimate moments with Shane in the public. Him creating a shark attack as an excuse to get out of the pool is a way for him to go back over to Shane and re-engage with him. And Shane does. He doesn't look away. He doesn't stand up, but he doesn't look away. And we can tell now that Shane isn't afraid of being attracted to Ilya anymore or what that means. Ilya being shown in slow motion with this looming posture and the power stance. It's dominance, but without aggression. It's a different kind of dominance than what we've seen of him so far. It's more of him saying, I want you to see me wanting you, and I'm doing it in public. And he does it in public at the pool, and he does it in public during the game. And even though he can't touch him there and he can't express himself fully, and we see him rub his nose, that's kind of him fighting against the joy, but it still overflows in both of them because neither can hide their smiles. And Shane looking down to hide his smile kind of encapsulates what he ends up doing all weekend, which is trying to contain his emotions because they're starting to overflow, which leads directly into the next scene on the beach, because in the books he had gone to the beach because he needed to get space. The whole weekend he's been trying not to touch Ilya. He's been trying to hide him and Ilya from the league so that they don't feed into the narrative of the rivalry. But he also acknowledges that the rivalry is important because it's the best way for them to hide their relationship. Ilya ends up finding him anyways, and he says, "Found you." And this line is really important because it reframes the entire weekend. He's been looking for Shane. He found Shane. Shane thinks he's hiding, and now the two of them are together, metaphorically and physically in this scene. They've gone through the trenches of years and years of not being able to speak to how they feel, and now they've got to the same place emotionally. Ilya goes into this conversation knowing that he wants to address the word compatible right away. And so when he brings up the word compatible, he's kind of just cutting through to the real question. And the camera favoring Ilya in this scene here is really important narratively because this is when he's being vulnerable now. He went back to his room and looked up the word just to make sure that he was absolutely 100% clear on what Shane meant when he said that him and Rose were not compatible. Shane says, "Oh," and again, just like we did at the bar scene, Ilya has to take it one step further to make sure that there's no exposition in his question. And Shane's body language is really important here because without eye contact, which was the same tell from the bar, he tells the truth but averts his gaze and says, "Yeah, we're not compatible, not in that way anyway." And that is so important because it's Shane admitting that there is a way that he is compatible. It's not with Rose, but that means it can be with Ilya. And that gives him the bravery to reach his hand closer. Ilya looks around to make sure that there's nobody watching them. And Shane takes that beat to go back to safe footing and ask where the two of them are going to be flying to the next day. And this hand sequence is one of the most carefully blocked shots of the show because they are showing that they're inches apart, jittery, checking their surroundings, trying to make casual conversation, but masking what's really happening here. So when Ilya closes the gap, it's silently him asking, "Is it okay if I do this?" And when Shane smiles openly, he is accepting that bid for connection. His facial expressions here are so perfect because it really is acceptance. He doesn't have any defense mechanisms going up, and that allows him to be brave and ask, "What room are you in?" And the implication of that in this moment is far less about a purely physical need. It's more of a representation of Shane and Ilya holding hands and stepping forward together into what their new relationship could look like. So combined, these three scenes accomplish a really beautiful metaphor because at the pool, Shane's able to kind of envision a life with Ilya that's more domestic. Then on the ice, we see that they already work together really, really well and effortlessly so. And then ending it with this scene on the beach, it's showing that they're also choosing to stop pretending like they don't work well together. And I love the detail that Ilya's thumb is on top of Shane's. The All-Star Hotel scene is the first time the show fully shows us Ilya as a person who has very real, non-negotiable stakes in this relationship. We see them on the beach together at sunset, and then it is 9:27 by the time that Shane comes to Ilya's door. In the book, Ilya is wondering if Shane is coming up to end their relationship. He doesn't know if this conversation is going to be an ending or a beginning. And it's the first time that Ilya admits that what they want might not actually matter. Ilya ignoring his brother's phone call is important because it's foreshadowing for what happens later in the episode, but it's also him choosing to prioritize Shane in this moment. Shane silently greets him, and he has his thumbs hooked in his pant pocket, which we know is a signal of him being uncomfortable or nervous. And his body is fully braced here, which Ilya picks up immediately and then says, "This looks serious," with his typical tinge of humor. This is meant to again show that he is nervous about what Shane could be saying to him in this scene, but he's trying to downplay it in order to protect himself. Shane tells Ilya that it's not that serious and asks him if he can sit down, which is an attempt for him to feel like he has more control over the situation. And Ilya obeys and waits for him to continue. But inside, we know he's really nervous about what Shane could have to say to him. The way this scene is shot, I hope you can recognize that this is actually the same hotel room set as the one Shane and Hayden were in earlier. Ilya also sits on top of this dresser, and there's a mini fridge in it, and it looks like there's ginger ale inside. But again, the way this is blocked, it's meant to show an emotional distance between them that they're going to close in this scene. Shane starts this conversation by asking, "It's not just me, right?" as a way to kind of mutually acknowledge what's going on here and have Ilya confirm that the shift he felt wasn't something he made up in his head. He follows that up with, "The last time we were together, it was different." This is when Ilya starts to name how wounded he was in the tuna melt scene out loud. In the book, Ilya shrugs and calls himself out and says that he knows it's the wrong reaction, but he felt such a horrifying swell of emotion that he couldn't let Shane see, so he tried to hide it. The addition of the line, "What was different, that you ran away," is the first time that Ilya calls out Shane for running away from him, but this is added into the show. It doesn't happen in the books, which is why I was so glad that in this scene in the show, Shane tries to repair things by saying, "Look, I'm sorry that I freaked out, okay?" But then Ilya says, "You freaked out over nothing," and avoids eye contact. And Shane is able to acknowledge the truth here, which is that it wasn't nothing. And he asks Ilya not to put the wall back up again, because what he's doing, which is being vulnerable, is hard enough without Ilya being an asshole on purpose. Ilya saying, "What do you want, Hollander?" is again him trying to mask and hide what he's feeling here because he's afraid Shane would see it. And Shane exhales because he doesn't seem to know what to say next. So Ilya fills the space with downplaying the situation to protect himself. Him calling it simple is a defense mechanism, but Shane is finally brave enough here to poke holes in Ilya's words by repeating the word simple, because they both know this is anything but simple. Ilya saying it's simple for me and shrugging, and Shane finally being brave enough to call him out for it and say bullshit. I was so proud of him because he's finally leaning into the truth instead of running away from it. In this moment in the books, Ilya is wondering why Shane's saying any of this now. Why now? The timing isn't fair to him with everything going on, especially at home in Russia. When Shane says, "I think I'm gay," it's the most dangerous sentence he's ever said out loud, and Ilya's laugh is often misinterpreted as him being insensitive, but in reality, it's him panicking. Because Shane saying that and admitting it threatens to really detonate Ilya's life, because he couldn't return to Russia if this ever got out. What makes you think that is another deflection that he goes into when in survival mode. When Shane snaps here, it's important because he's rejecting Ilya not taking him seriously. He doesn't want Ilya to make this about him. He wants him to validate him. Very rarely does Shane raise his voice, so we know that this is a very big deal. Ilya saying no, not completely is also an important clarification and shows again that Ilya has very much accepted this part of himself for years, whereas Shane's still in the process of doing that. And it's also why him saying, "Well, I think I am completely," is so important, because Shane is finally not denying things. There's no room for misinterpretation now. So when he says, okay, so you're gay, so what? Ilya kind of contradicts himself because he throws his hands up like he doesn't care, but this reaction is because he cares too much. Shane saying, well, it's sort of a big deal to me, at least, sorry if I'm being boring again, is him asking for recognition and acceptance from the one person he can talk to about this. And the sorry for being boring is really emphasizing that he feels minimized by Ilya. And Ilya's body language and him collapsing in this way is not so much him being defeated by Shane's backlash, so much as it's him realizing that the only way to get through this conversation is to be brave and be honest. And Shane is pushing them towards that, whether Ilya wants to go there or not, and he knows that. So if he's going to do this, he'll move closer to Shane when he does it, and his body language stays quite defeated, but him moving and being closer is a big deal. Because again, this scene is them learning how to communicate with each other in real time here, and also learning what the other person needs from a partner emotionally in times of pain or stress or sadness. Ilya saying, why are you telling me this? And Shane saying, who else am I going to tell? This is Ilya being defensive, like, why are you putting this on me? And Shane answers honestly, which is because there's no one else for him to tell. Ilya nodding is meant to be confirmation that he knows what it's like to be alone with these feelings, but he's not having eye contact with Shane. What's important is that Shane is looking at Ilya this whole time. Once they kind of remove that obstacle at the top of this conversation, Ilya's body language changes and he slides his hand back and opens up in a way that's trying to lean into Shane's request for him to be more vulnerable and have this conversation with him. When Shane says it's not just being gay, it's you, this is him kind of naming the underlying threat of all of this, which is that he can survive hiding and being gay, but he doesn't know if he can survive wanting Ilya, because the arch rival line is a way for them to put a name to the danger of the hockey optics, but emotionally, he knows how strong his feelings and emotions are for Ilya now. So both of those things are real threats. Ilya saying that's why it's a secret is him jumping in quickly to put it back into familiar territory. It's sort of similar to how he said Hollander after the tuna melt scene in episode 4. He's trying to put the genie back in the lamp. And this opens up the opportunity for Shane to apologize a second time for how he behaved in the tuna melt scene at Ilya's house. And again, it's him attempting to repair that wound that Ilya has made obvious to him. Shane wants to recontextualize that moment for Ilya and let him know how he actually felt and why he ran away. Which is why he says, but before that, it was nice, because Shane is trying to reframe that moment by calling the interaction, which was taking place outside of the norm. You know, they weren't hooking up there. They were actually being normal. Him calling it nice is a big deal. And so when Ilya agrees and says it was, that's the step where Shane can see he's finally getting somewhere with Ilya. But then Shane takes it one step further and says it felt like we were something. And this is a line that Ilya can't really cope with, because something implies a future being there. And Ilya, before Shane even walked into this room, has kind of admitted to himself that that can't happen because of Russia. So he says we can't be something Hollander. And it's not because he doesn't want to, it's because he thinks they can't. So then when Shane says, would you want to be if we could, he's removing logistics and consequences and potential outcomes. He's just asking what Ilya wants. And then when Ilya doesn't allow himself to answer that hypothetical and Shane says that's not what I asked, he's being very pointed with his questioning here, because Ilya keeps refusing to answer the question. When Ilya explodes and says, what does it matter? It's because he feels like Shane is forcing a hypothetical world onto him and he can't exist there. He can't allow himself to have that kind of hope. And Shane flinching here is important because he's realizing that using force is not going to work on Ilya, so he takes another approach. Him admitting that he can't keep pretending that he doesn't like him is a huge deal. And the camera moves to Shane's face because this is his emotional point of view now. And he says, yeah, I do. I think I like you maybe a little too much. Admitting this to Ilya reframes all the times that he's panicked or put distance between them. And in the book, Ilya says his heart clenches because that's what he's been avoiding hearing for years. So he says, don't do this, Hollander. I'm not. And in the book, Shane actually finishes the sentence with worth it. And Ilya corrects him by saying he's not gay and he can't be anything close to it because of Russia. Instead, they have them pause for a beat here before Ilya says, I wouldn't be able to go home, ever. And this is the first time Ilya fully explains the true cost of them being together to Shane. What's important is Shane listens and asks questions and stays really calm because, again, he's learning how Ilya communicates and how he needs to be supported here. And if we're Shane, every single detail that he gets here is really important, knowing that his father is police, his brother is police, his mother is dead. This is telling Shane that not only does Ilya not have any safety at home in Russia, he doesn't have any safety at home within his own family. Much of the dialogue here where Ilya is explaining that his father is sick and Shane says like crazy, and he confirms to us and to Shane that he's not mentally stable. He is a little crazy, but then he clarifies more sick-like, and Shane again is asking questions gently before Ilya finally says dementia, and that's when the wall breaks, because this is a disease that comes with grief. The caretaking doesn't have a positive outcome. It's exhausting. It feels like lonely and helpless, and he's guilty because he's not there with his father now. In the book, after he makes this admission, Ilya thinks to himself, there, now someone new. And so this is an emotional release in many ways. And so when Shane validates him by saying that's awful, he doesn't need to elaborate because awful sums it up perfectly for Ilya. It's the first time that his pain is being acknowledged by somebody else. We've seen him in the montages at home with his father taking care of him. We know that he's paying his brother, who hates him, to take care of his father. And we know that he feels guilty for not being able to support him, even though he has such a complicated relationship. Ilya turns away because crying is not allowed in his world, and we haven't seen that side of his face this whole scene, so we didn't even see the tear developing. And he turns away from Shane, not to hide from Shane, but to contain his emotions. Shane touches his knee there, which again is like a grounding technique for Ilya, but it's also a way for him to say, I see you, I'm not leaving. Shane saying the word hey is asking Ilya to allow him to support him, and we see him use that again in the finale episode too. Ilya saying sorry is equally devastating because this is a learned behavior to apologize for having emotions. He would have been taught by his family that his emotional needs were burdensome. When Shane moves into Ilya's lap, it's a way for him to try and take control of the situation and be an anchor for Ilya without him asking for it. When he says no, it's him telling Ilya that he doesn't have to apologize. He isn't wrong for being sad. He's not alone in these emotions, which is why this kiss is so emotionally charged. He's putting himself in Ilya's space to provide him comfort. He wants Ilya to feel like he can cry in front of him. He doesn't have to hide it from him. This kiss doesn't imply a greater need. It's just presenting Shane's support and presence for Ilya here. And it's crazy that they filmed this on the very first day of the shoot because it has the weight of a 7-year-long span. This sequence of shots is really beautiful because we're up close with Shane and Ilya in a similar situation as when we saw them on the couch in this position in episode 4. And we can see how Ilya is pulling Shane closer to him. He now understands that this feels good to have somebody to confide in and have someone acknowledge his emotions in this way. It's quietly telling you that that's the kind of relationship that this has now become. And the comparison here with the Vegas shot is such a great visual representation of how their emotional distance gap has closed because there's no negative space between them anymore. This is a teaching moment for Ilya, who would recognize that physical touch in this moment is helping him. So he's sure to provide this to Shane in the finale episode as well. And we see that Shane doesn't pull away or panic here like the last time. And it's huge for Ilya to see that. This is also why the show then withholds the sex scene that follows this, because this is meant to be the biggest moment of the episode. Everything physical between them that happens afterwards is just for them. And that's a confirmation that things have changed. The show removes dialogue from the book here, and that is also a narrative technique because it's the first time that their intimacy is kept private from us. In the book, we learn that Ilya's necklace belonged to his mother. He asks Shane to stay twice. They talk about going somewhere after the season ends and realizing that there's nowhere they could go where they wouldn't be seen. It's also the first time Shane mentions the cottage. We don't get that in the show. By the time Shane's leaving in the show, the audience understands that they both know their relationship is still going to be somewhat impossible. And we know that Shane wants to stay, and we know that Shane wants him to stay just by this look and pause in the doorway. The camera shooting from over Shane's shoulder and having Ilya be so far away is also a great narrative choice because this moment is no longer something the audience needs to be close to. It's more private now. And when Ilya uses Shane's name again to say goodnight, it's the return to the first name familiarity, and the first time he does it since it went sideways in episode 4. Shane's reaction to laugh and how soft he looks and not being able to control his smile, it tells us that everything has changed. What has just transpired is irreversible because unlike Shane leaving in the tuna melt scene or even the Vegas hotel scene, he does not leave this room feeling empty for the first time. He leaves feeling happy. And for Ilya, we see him rolling onto his back and touching the bridge of his nose, which is another physical cue we've seen him do a lot when he is overwhelmed or emotional, and he does it when he's lying or processing information. So holding the bridge of his nose is likely him needing his body and his mind to sort of reset in the aftermath of the scene because it's a lot for him. Shane's gone now, so he doesn't need to monitor himself anymore. He can just feel the weight of what happened. But Ilya also knows that nothing has been resolved yet. They still have a long way to go, and he doesn't know how they're going to navigate it together, so it clues us in that this isn't over, so to speak. In the scene after All-Star Weekend, the show lets us believe briefly that things are getting easier for Shane and Ilya, and then carefully shows us that they're actually getting deeper and potentially harder for Ilya. In the books, they've already started to text more casually and have more normal conversations, and mostly about hockey, but Shane notes that it was hard for them to even stop talking one day. The show implies that because Shane typically takes a long time responding to Ilya, and here he answers his text messages immediately with no hesitation. In the book, Shane says that they usually slow things down in March because of playoffs coming up and the season getting more intense. And in Ilya's point of view, he talks about how he really wants to have a whole day with Shane, a weekend, a week. He wants to be somewhere no one could interrupt them because he needs to get Shane out of his system, and then eventually he'd have to walk away because this is getting too complicated. So Shane didn't expect to see Ilya before or after the game on this day. And we see that Shane's no longer overthinking anything between him and Ilya. He is actively putting his clothes on as he's telling Ilya, no, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do this. And Ilya's line, everything we do is a bad idea, is really kind of the thesis of their relationship. But Shane leaving anyway shows that his fear of the consequences is losing to the pull he feels towards Ilya. Hayden clocking Boston Lily and knowing that Shane left his phone unlocked on the bed is key because Shane isn't guarding this the way he was before. And previously, his reaction to Hayden noticing Boston Lily was panic, but now it's excitement because he picks up his phone immediately and starts responding right away. And again, earlier Shane would have hesitated. Now he's moving first, thinking about it later. The way that the show uses the texting habits is such a genius way of showcasing that their relationship is changing. When Shane first arrived to Ilya's house in the books, he thought that something must be wrong with Ilya for him to want him to come over before their game. And he described seeing Ilya's eyes were dark with something more than lust this time, and he starts to panic internally, but Ilya was saying his name, so he didn't want to ruin it. The show choosing to skip the sex scene again here is important because it's saying to us, the viewer, that what matters now is not what they're doing physically, it's what they're doing after. And Ilya ignoring Alexei's phone call, again, is foreshadowing because we've seen him call multiple times and Ilya ignore it each time. It also is a way for us to see that Ilya is more willing to let Shane into his internal world because he's the one who says, my brother, whereas before he would have never disclosed that. Shane gives Ilya the opportunity to answer the phone call, and it's a way for him to say, I'm offering space for you to confide in me here. And he does that multiple times in this episode. And Ilya says he doesn't want to talk to his brother. And Shane follows it up with, is everything okay at home? Normally we've seen Ilya deflect with humor or redirect with sex, but here he's establishing a boundary by saying, enough please. And that's not him putting up a wall, which is new for him. And Shane listens. The way that he touches Shane's knee is also an important physical beat in the series because it's not sexual. It's meant to be more of an emotional grounding, but at the same time reassures Shane that he's not upset that Shane asked the question. And we see Ilya do this again in the cottage scene on the couch after the Hayden phone call, which is a way for the show to confirm for us in that episode that this is a learned gesture. Ilya also verbally reassures Shane by saying, it's okay. And he makes a point to turn towards him when he says that. In the books, Ilya tells Shane that his father is dying, but that's not the problem on the phone. It's actually his stepmother, Polina, because she wants money. And he admits to Shane that he has been sending them all money this whole time, and they still want more. This ended up being added into the monologue that we see Ilya tell Shane in Russian, because it's not included here. And in the book, Ilya tells Shane that he admits he likes talking to his father better now because he was a real asshole when he was himself. And Shane asks if he's going to go home to Russia, and that's when Ilya tells him he should go back to his hotel. Shane making this joke about winning tonight is such a great callback to episode 1 because it also reinforces that emotional shorthand. When Shane first called Ilya an asshole in the hotel room, and Ilya announcing Shane Hollander is an asshole is funny to the viewer, obviously, but Shane laughing instead of being offended tells us he feels included and understood in the joke and not mocked like he previously would feel, because he is someone who takes everything so literally. So this is huge to know that Ilya understands his humor and also can play into it in a way that he accepts. The upbeat music that we hear over that scene carries into the locker room, where we see Alexei calling his phone again, and Ilya choosing to have a lot of swagger walking in there, command the room, and it clues us into how good he feels right now ahead of this game. But the Alexei phone call reminds us that Ilya can't outrun this stuff forever. By joking and talking about collecting money, it's avoidance. He's just avoiding the hard thing. But I love the way he jokes in this scene because stuff like this happens in hockey all the time. And this is a window into how when he's feeling good, Ilya is actually a really funny captain. And when they come back into the locker room, it's implied that they won. And Ilya goes back on his word and says they each owe him $3,000, which means he had a hat trick against Shane's team. In the book, he scored twice and Shane had scored once, and Boston won by 2 goals. Because we already knew that Alexei is looming in the background, it makes sense here that Ilya returns back to his stall and he's getting another phone call from him. So when he finally answers in Russian and asks, "What do you want?" he slams his mask back into place, and we don't hear the phone call because we don't need to. The cut to black does the work for us. We get a clue that it's the next day, and it looks like they're back in their home rink. In the books, Shane and the Metros flew to Detroit to play the next day, and both Shane and Ilya in their own POVs in the book had planned on seeing each other that night after the game. Shane had stayed up all night worrying about looking too eager and not wanting to text Ilya first, and then eventually when he realized he wasn't going to hear from him, he fell asleep, and Ilya had resolved himself to admit that he wanted to see Shane as much as possible. When JJ starts talking about Ilya not traveling with the team to Nashville, Shane's concern outs him emotionally in front of his teammates. And I love that we don't see JJ initially. Our only focus is on Shane reacting to JJ's words. And when he hears about Rozanov, his body starts moving before his mouth does. And he walks towards his stall to get his phone, where we hear Hayden ask, "He didn't get hurt last night, did he?" And Shane looks serious the whole time. Multiple times he answers too quickly. "No, he didn't. No, he's not. I mean, he didn't seem sick." And both JJ and Hayden are really kind of indifferent about it. It's just news in the cycle that's relevant to them and the hockey team. But Shane picks up his phone and texts Ilya, "Are you okay?" without overthinking, which is the first time that Shane reaches out to Ilya out of being scared for him. And we can see Shane wait a beat to see if his message goes through, or maybe if Ilya is even going to text him back before he puts his phone back behind him in the stall. In the book, they go to play a game against Detroit, and Shane doesn't play well, even though they won. He was more focused on getting back to the dressing room to check his phone. And he looks through the internet for any news about Ilya, but doesn't see anything. In the show, we go back to Shane's home, and he still hasn't gotten a response from Ilya. He tries to distract himself by getting a ginger ale and willing a text message to come through on his phone, which I think is such a relatable way of approaching this. And when he finally can't handle it anymore, he rushes back to his phone at the table and picks it up. And Shane only hits one button, so clearly he had his text thread open and sitting on his phone since he arrived. We know as viewers that Shane has never called Ilya yet. In the book, he makes this phone call from a hallway outside the dressing room in Detroit, and Ilya actually does answer. Ilya also calls him back 2 days later, but the show condenses a few of their phone calls into this one ahead of the monologue, and bits of what was said in those conversations end up in the monologue itself. Here we hear the ringtone, "Hi, it's Ilya, I will never listen to your voicemail," which is hilarious, but it rings twice and then goes to voicemail, so it's implied that Ilya denied the call. We go back to this wide shot of Shane at the kitchen table, and he is trying to busy himself by hanging his jacket on the back of the chair, putting his phone into his pocket, and distracting himself in his room, trying to read again. So when Ilya finally calls him back, this is shot to make us understand that this is intimate. It's very late. It would be well after midnight in Russia. It's a Zoom call instead of a voice call, which we are clued into when Shane does not bring the phone to his ear. I love the lighting on the phone glowing on Shane's face, and then he picks it up immediately and asks, "Hey, are you okay?" And we right off the bat establish the glasses moment because that's very personal. Ilya saying you wear glasses is more of him pointing it out than asking, and Shane taking them off right away and saying it's just for reading. I think he assumes Ilya is going to make fun of him for them, and he tries to get back on track by asking, "Where are you?" To which Ilya says home and then asks Shane, "Put them back on, please." I love that when Shane asks him Boston and ignores him, he's squinting. And when Ilya answers, we flip the camera to him in his father's living room, which we've seen before, which is another amazing use of the video wall. Ilya is smiling at Shane on his phone, and we get this awesome sound mixing of the wind blowing outside. So we already have this atmosphere of it's cold out, but Ilya is in his tank top. Shane asks, "Are you okay?" And Ilya is grinning at Shane and says, "I'll be better when I see you in your glasses again." So to appease him, he shakes his head and puts them back on and asks, "Happy?" And Ilya says, "Happier." So we know that he's not happy. And Shane uses that to venture to ask, "Is your father?" And Ilya confirms, "Yes, dead." I love that we can hear him release like a tight breath that he was holding. And he says, "I'm so sorry." And Ilya looks up and asks, "What are people saying about me?" as a way to kind of deflect again. Shane tells him nothing, that the media is being secretive and the Raiders haven't disclosed anything, and he cuts Shane off by saying good. He looks away from Shane when he says, "I'll be back by the end of the week," and Shane tells him, "You need to take more time than that," and Ilya looks confused by this. And he deflects again by saying, "Why? So you can catch up with me in the scoring race?" And Shane tells him, "No, I'm being serious." And there's a pause before we cut back to Shane speaking on his phone. And I love that he makes it more serious throughout this conversation. He doesn't let Ilya get away with his deflections, and he says, "You can talk to me about whatever. I want to help if I can." Ilya's face softens at that, and then he pauses and says, "Take off your clothes." And we can, again, hear the wind howling outside, and Shane say, "What?" kind of in an astonished voice. And Ilya moves down to the coffee table. What's nice about this scene ending this way with them undressing is it's less about Ilya trying to escape his grief, and I read it as more of him needing a connection in that moment so he's not alone in it. He's inviting Shane into his grief with him. When he tells Shane glasses back on, it's quietly adorable because we can see them building more of a connection where he sees Shane as this unfiltered, casual side of him outside of hockey and the pressures of their hookup, which again is a big step before they spend 2 weeks together in the cottage and really get to know each other on that level even further. They're becoming more exposed now with one another, and previously they might have thought that would be really painful for them both, but they're learning that opening up like this actually brings them closer, which we see in Ilya's monologue when he finally admits his true feelings about Shane. When we start the Russian funeral scene, Ilya is standing alone in front of a window, looking out that window with a very stoic expression on his face, vodka in hand, in his boxers, very stripped back. The song that plays over this very short scene is called "My Sinful Soul." And when you research that song, it gives a lot of added context to this scene because it frames Ilya's grief as something that he's been trained to experience alone, privately, and he associates grief as feeling shameful. The song is very much associated with shame, inheritance, and loss, which makes sense because Ilya grew up in a home where love was conditional, his silence was rewarded and expected, and him expressing his emotion was seen as a weakness and in some cases a sin. He's used to carrying grief alone, very quietly, and by the end of this scene, that changes. When we get to the actual table setting, it is in a very dark room with a lot of negative black space around it, and the lighting and the sound editing in this scene in particular are very impressive to me because they clue us into things before they actually happen. Ilya and Svetlana are sat together at one end of the table, and we can see Ilya eating closed-mouthed and upright. There's a slice of rye bread on top of a glass of vodka, which is a gesture for the person who has passed in Russian culture. And I believe that the medal on the table is the Order of Courage. It's important that we're seeing Ilya eat at the dinner table this way because it's in contrast to how we'll see him eating at the dinner table in the finale scene. And the song that plays in this scene is called Cranes. It's important because it would frame his father's death as being very patriotic and noble, which we know he was not. The camera angle implies that we are looking through Alexei's eyes, watching Ilya from the other end of the table, and that Ilya can sense his eyes on him, which is representative of the hypervigilance of someone growing up with lifelong criticism. His cold stare back at Ilya is indicative of what it must have felt like for Ilya his entire life, and we can see Ilya's niece in this scene too. Ilya then breaks the eye contact and whispers to Svetlana before getting up and leaving the table for the other room, and the camera lingers on her face so that we know she can sense that he's uncomfortable and she is waiting to see if he needs her. Making Svetlana his childhood friend is also a really effective way to understand her importance in this scene, and she becomes really pivotal because, again, this is not a scene that we get from the books. This is all added in strictly for the show. When Ilya walks into this back room, we see that green light for the first time again, which is symbolic of his brother's greed and envy that we know he has for Ilya. He goes back here to escape the unease of that dinner table, and we see him walk up to a mirror and look at himself in it before we see Alexei following him into this back room through the mirror. This scene uses mirrors a lot, and I actually really think it's a beautiful metaphor for a lot of things, and it reminds me as well of the Russian bathroom scene where we're looking at the back of the character and the front simultaneously, and Ilya looks defeated before Alexei even speaks here. He looks behind him to make sure no one else is coming before he tells Ilya to stop avoiding him, and Ilya responds back, "If only." We see Alexei touch his nose the same way we've seen Ilya do it multiple times throughout the series before he confronts him and says, "So?" And that's when Ilya turns to face him directly, and we get this great camera spin and also clued into how close to the table they actually are. Ilya's "so what" enrages Alexei, so he shoves him into the wall, and we can infer that the physical violence between them was often initiated by him. Ilya yells, "Don't touch me," which I've also seen translated as "get your hands off of me." And this is Ilya's first verbal boundary we see him set in this scene. He pushes Alexei's hands off of his chest, but is met with a finger up in warning, pointing out that the table is close to them so people can hear them, and Ilya waits for Alexei's next words. He tells Ilya to tell him what the plan is, and this is indicative of his attachment to his father because he's not even letting Ilya have the duration of this dinner before he's already asking what Ilya can do for him. And Ilya responds back with, "I don't know yet. He just died. Can I have a minute to breathe?" Alexei then makes it about himself, asking, "And me? What about me?" And this is when the camera angle switches to Ilya's face, and we get to see his reaction to Alexei saying, "Do I get to breathe too?" which makes Ilya shake his head in disbelief. This is when Alexei twists the knife. He says what might be the most cutting thing he could say to Ilya, given that he has been supporting their family this entire time. And this is when Ilya finally starts fighting back. And there will never not be a moment where Alexei is not demanding more from him, and he calculates his cruelty towards Ilya. He reframes Ilya's success as betraying their family and tries to shame him into compliance here. And then when Ilya questions him, he starts reframing it as a moral obligation because Alexei has a family. He's positioning himself as a martyr in order to make Ilya feel guilty again, because Ilya already believes he failed by not being there. To him, his absence is already unforgivable, and Alexei knows this and tries to exploit it. And he starts jostling Ilya's body because he's losing control of Ilya. Yes, he still feels guilty and responsible, but he also does not accept Alexei's abuse as fair treatment. He knows that no amount of his own sacrifice will be enough for Alexei because Alexei is committed to hating him. When Svetlana enters the room, this is another really pivotal moment. She's come in to aid Ilya and remind Alexei that he's in public, and when he says these words about her, Ilya's resolve breaks completely. We see him scream and push Alexei into the wall on the other side of the room, furious, because Ilya could not defend himself or his mother, but he can defend Svetlana. And she tells him to stop, but he gets a punch in on Alexei's face, and this is the first time he physically fights back. And Alexei's arm comes up in defense, and he's ready to punch him again. But Svetlana's the one who has to remind him he's not worth it. He's not worth anything. You can see in Alexei's face that he's shocked by Ilya's actions here. I don't think he ever thought Ilya would ever fight back. And you can see him looking at Ilya's body shaking, and you know he's probably never seen Ilya lose his composure like this before. Seeing Ilya's face is heartbreaking because he's furious and hurt and shaking. And I love this shot because we can see Svetlana in the mirror over Alexei's shoulder, and her face is just as disapproving. The sound in this scene is also great because we can hear Ilya's breathing audibly for the remainder of the scene and throughout all of his dialogue, and it adds to how tense he is and how upset he is. Then, without being prompted or told, Ilya dictates what's going to happen because he is done being told what to do. In the books, he'd already decided that his brother could have his apartment because he never wants to go back to Russia. The trust for his niece is a new addition, which I think shows that even with this complicated relationship with his family, Ilya does want to do right by them out of obligation and duty. And Alexei's face is perfect as he listens to this and realizes that his plan is not going to benefit him fully because his daughter can only have this trust when she's 18, which means Alexei can't touch it. Him blinking here is a perfect way to showcase his disbelief. When Ilya says to him, "You will never ever contact me again," it is said with so much anger but total confidence, and he follows it up by warning him that if he does, he will use his power and fame to make sure that Alexei can never show his face in the city again. So Alexei is quite literally watching his world implode as Ilya takes away all of his power in real time, and the hold he had over Ilya his whole life is finally gone. And Ilya, you can still tell, is pained that it has come to this. When he says, "Take what I offer, shut your mouth, and walk away," Alexei has to swallow his pride, and he tilts his chin up to show some shred of dignity despite this, looks at Svetlana again to see if she has anything else to say, but is met with zero sympathy and moves to leave the room. And again, this is a great use of the mirror because we watch him fix his tie, and the angle is clever because we're looking over Ilya's shoulder and getting both Svetlana and Alexei in the mirror together. Alexei touches his cheek, runs his fingers through his hair, and tries to collect himself before entering the restaurant because he and Ilya both have their own ways of composing themselves and putting the mask back on. And he pauses one last time before it cuts to Ilya's face. This very short moment between Ilya and Svetlana adds so much depth to the source material because we never knew what prompted Ilya to call Shane in that moment. In the book, we don't even know what Ilya says in the monologue, only that he ends up confessing his love at the end of it. And we don't know that before he would have stood up to his brother or that Svetlana is the reason he felt so seen and loved, similar to how Rose was a big component of Shane being brave. Svetlana puts words to things that Ilya won't admit because she knows that he deserves her, but she also knows he doesn't want her. She already knows that his heart belongs to someone else, and that's doubled down when she actually uses the name Jane. She's not jealous or hurt by this. She understands that his love for Jane is something he's been hiding from her, and it's important that in this moment she reassures him that she's not going anywhere and that she loves him enough to know that Jane needs to know how lucky he is, which is monumental because she's acknowledging that she knows that Ilya's secret is that he's in love with a man, and she is accepting of it. She will love him no matter what or who he loves, and she's giving him permission and encouragement to choose happiness. When she kisses him and leaves him to be alone, it's very much a mirror of what Rose did to Shane outside of the restaurant. And I love this scene here because we get to watch Ilya process this. And even though he looks so sad and childlike, he has been relieved of a very large burden. She helps him to be brave in the same way that eventually seeing Scott will help Ilya to be brave. And I always go back to how wonderfully the women in this show are portrayed because both Rose and Svetlana help Shane and Ilya name their truth without forcing them to say it. Both of them love these men without any expectation or possession over them, and they're huge catalysts for the two of them coming together. If you look in the mirror, you can see his arms jerking and twitching, and we know that from episode 4, after his phone call with his father, this is how he shakes off his stress and tries to self-regulate again, which makes him leaving the funeral and calling Shane right away so much more impactful, because Shane now becomes part of him self-soothing. We get to hear Ilya's Russian monologue. We open the scene with him texting Shane asking if he's alone, and Shane quickly leaves his hotel room to speak with him in the stairway. Ilya asks permission before he calls Shane, and I love that Shane runs to the stairs so that he can be available to Ilya as soon as possible. In the book, this scene takes place 2 days later, and Shane has been playing in Buffalo, and he hadn't been expecting to hear from Ilya again. Shane answers the phone with no formalities, just "how are you?" And at first Ilya lies and says okay, then he becomes more truthful and admits that he's probably bad. In the book, he asks, "How is your family treating you?" And Ilya tells him, "Like I should not be here," which Shane finds ridiculous, and Ilya says, "Well, I'm paying for everything, so it makes me of use." The show omits the implication of Ilya's stepmother being worried about what's going to happen now that his father has died. So instead, in the show, Ilya starts telling Shane that his family is at their worst, and really deepens this scene by letting Ilya articulate something more painful, which is that the fear his brother is experiencing is what is making him so cruel, and that cruelty has made Ilya cruel in return. What's devastating about this is that Ilya counts his own very long overdue self-defense as him being terrible back, which is placing him on the same moral level as his brother's own abuse. Even after he stands up for himself, even after he's given Alexei a home, set up a trust for his niece, demanded that he not contact him anymore, Ilya still minimizes his own pain and then shows empathy towards his brother who has hurt him the most. Shane asks him, "Is it very upsetting?" And Ilya doesn't hesitate before he says, "Yes, but maybe I'm upset about the wrong thing." When Shane asks for clarification, Ilya says he wishes it could be different, because what hurts the most for him is not just the conflict, but the impossibility of being truly known by his father. In the book, he says he always wished that he had heard his father tell him that he was proud of him. And that realization is really overwhelming for him, and it's part of the reason why he says that English is too hard for him right now. I also think the underlying message of wanting to be known by his father truly is being known by his father as bisexual and being accepted for it. Shane says that he wishes he understood Russian so that he could talk to him about it easier. And Ilya does a great callback to Shane's perfect French, which was a nod to episode 1 when we saw him taunting him while watching him on the TV. Just like in the show, in the book, Ilya grumbles that he could probably learn it in a week, perfect with no accent. But I like that the show adds him saying bonjour at the end so that Shane can correct him and say that's French, Ilya. It's such a Shane thing to say and do because he's so literal and he has to point out the obvious, and Ilya knows that and uses that as a way to make a joke between them in this otherwise very heavy moment. And it's probably because he just needed to hear Shane laugh. Shane asks him where he is, and Ilya tells him walking. In the book, it's in a park, and he says, "I needed to get out." I really love the colors in this scene because, again, we see these orange and red tones as comforting and safety throughout this entire series, and Ilya is surrounded by that tone in this scene, which is a great visual cue that Shane provides that feeling to Ilya now. That's when Shane has the idea to offer Ilya a way to express himself better by speaking in his own language, even though Shane can't converse back with him. In the book, he gets self-conscious about suggesting it and almost takes it back before Ilya finally says okay. And this is where the show deviates really heavily from the books, because in the books, Shane just listens to him talk, and he described it as being very animated and flustered, but we as readers never know what Ilya says, ever. The sound editing here is brilliant because Shane describes hearing his voice as washing over him. So having Ilya's voice go from coming through a phone to present with Shane and him closing his eyes, it all adds to that atmosphere. Shane describes this as feeling intimate, like they were somehow sharing a bigger secret now than when they had slept together. The Russian to English translation of this monologue is slightly different than the subtitled version. The Russian to English translation is actually, "I'll never go back here again. I hate everything here and everyone hates me." Ilya starts listing off all of the things that he's done throughout this entire time that he's been at home, making sure the food is perfect, making sure his father is buried next to his parents, that his grave is perfect. And through it all Ilya hears is that it's not enough. They say to him, "I want more, Ilya. I need more, Ilya. More, 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 more." Ilya is now putting words to things that we have watched transpire throughout the duration of his time at home in this episode, and even before then. Another change from the Russian to English translation is him saying, "I can't give these people a damn thing. I gave them everything and I feel empty. They don't give a damn." Calling himself an ATM or an enemy is interesting because it represents a paradox, because that means he's either useful or threatening. And we heard that in a lot of what Alexei says to him in the scene prior to this one. Ilya saying, "My brother, he always hated me, I know why," is such an interesting line to me as well. And I did make an entire separate video on why I think Alexei hates him so much, because it's multi-layered. Ilya represents so many trigger points for him. It's not just one reason, but Ilya has clearly internalized some sort of responsibility for his brother's cruelty. And just like with his father, I think he deeply wishes that things were different. And this is where the context from other episodes matters, is because he says, "It kills me that he cared for my father and I didn't." We know as the viewers that Ilya paid for everything. He cared deeply when his father was upset and left alone. When he went home, he was caring for him. But he doesn't give himself credit for any of that because he thinks because he wasn't physically there, it's not the same. And his unresolved guilt around that is probably one of the reasons why he thinks he deserves Alexei's hatred. In the scene before this, we heard Alexei weaponize that against Ilya to make him feel guilty. I do think it's very likely that Alexei knows Ilya is bisexual, because Ilya says he'll never forgive me for any of it for existing, which I think is pretty telling. And that's what makes Ilya feel so alone, because his family is gone, his home is gone. Ilya has survived his whole life by being needed, and he has eliminated that from his life now. And then he corrects himself by saying, "No, I actually have Svetlana," which is important for him to acknowledge that he is loved by someone. He's not entirely abandoned. But by this point, after his conversation with her, he's able to categorize the limits of that love that he has with her. He's not lying when he says, "And I love her and she loves me," but it's not in the way that I love you. Ilya pausing here and having to take a beat before he actually says those words out loud is really monumental. And I'm sure a lot of people have noticed here that as he pauses, there is a cop car that drives by in the background, which reminds us again of the huge implications of him admitting that out loud while in Russia. Not like "I love you" is stating this like a fact that he can't ignore anymore. He didn't choose this. This is something that was not planned for him. And him admitting that "I only want you, it's always only you," is basically saying this was inevitable, which leads directly to the line, "I love you so much and I don't know what to do with it," which again is translated differently on the subtitles. And it's so vulnerable because this confession isn't planned, it's not polished, and that's kind of the beauty of it. Ilya didn't know he was going to speak in Russian, and everything came out flooding out of him candidly. I think it was more like a relief for him to finally say it. And I love that as he says, "Okay, I'm done," we get the ending note of the song playing in the background and Shane smiling. And when he opens his eyes again, he asks, "Do you feel better?" And we get this audible sigh and breath when Ilya says, "Yes. Thank you." Shane saying, "Maybe you could teach me Russian someday," is a bid for connection to show him he's invested in knowing him more fully. And when Ilya teases him back, listing only useful phrases, that creates levity in this moment. In the books, Ilya is actually nervous, thinking that Shane may have recorded their call or known what he was saying. And in Shane's point of view, he says without thinking, "I wish you were here right now," which is something they've never allowed themselves to say before. In the books, he actually can't believe he said it out loud because they don't wish to be together, and he's embarrassed, but that embarrassment goes away when Ilya in the book says "me too" in English, but in the show he says in Russian, "I wish I was too." We get this amazing shot of him turning to smile because he can't contain the emotion, and it's such a small but impactful choice. In the book, Ilya describes feeling lighter. He had been carrying this secret around for so long, locked away inside himself, that he felt relieved when he acknowledges it. I think that one look kind of encapsulates that. And then he turns and walks away, still on the phone, and we do not get to hear the rest of their conversation, which again is so great narratively because it keeps it private from the viewer. The scenes that take place after the Russian monologue scene play out quite differently in the show than they do in the books for a number of key reasons. The main difference is that Shane and Ilya use phone calls while Ilya is still in Russian to discuss him becoming American or Canadian, marrying Shane to get a passport. Shane tells Ilya he made a donation to the Alzheimer's Society in honor of his father. Ilya asks Shane what his bedroom looks like, because in the books he's never actually been in it. And the biggest change is that Shane asks Ilya to come to the cottage on the phone. And in the books, it's actually after Shane invites him to the cottage that Ilya sees him with his glasses for the first time. If you haven't, I highly suggest reading those scenes in the books because there's so many little moments that we kind of gloss over in the show. By the end of Ilya's time in Russia, he's pretty much resolved to never go back there, and he admits to himself that it was never supposed to get to this point. He was never supposed to fall in love with Shane Hollander. In the show, it's been a week. Ilya is back in the States, and Boston is playing against Montreal. This game is supposed to be taking place around April of 2017. It's also meant to be the last time that Boston and Montreal played each other in the regular season, and the first time Ilya is seeing Shane face-to-face after all of his phone conversations with him while away. In hockey, you are not allowed to cross over the red line during warm-ups, so putting their conversation here in the middle of the ice is very symptomatic. As a hockey player myself, I love all of the physicality that they clearly taught both Connor and Hudson to implement here. I'd say hockey is arguably the hardest sport for an actor to emulate because skating is incredibly difficult. But all of these little micro moments that they have together where they're stretching in ways that hockey players do, or Shane here is wiping the snow off the end of his blade of his stick. Those are little details that I personally really appreciate. Here we see Shane give Ilya the code to his front door, which is a huge deal because up until this point he's been sneaking him in through the back door. Probably a pun, but also more of a way to showcase that things are changing between them again, and to tell us as the viewer that they had planned to see each other that night after the game. In the books, Shane notices that Ilya has a tightening in his jaw, and in the chapter before this, Ilya is basically resolving himself to ending it with Shane, or knowing that it has to end eventually, which is prompted by the way that their last phone call had ended. It made Ilya's heart stop, because his deepest fear was that he'd be kicked out of the NHL or not offered a spot on a team if people found out about his secret. And then he would have to go back to Russia, and he didn't want to think about what would happen to him, but he also knew that Shane would be impacted by this too, and despite what the hockey world believed, Ilya did not want that. This is also a moment where I could tell Hudson didn't know how to stop, so he just kind of slams himself into the boards, but the way he grabs the water bottle and drinks the water is very, very close to how it's done when you play hockey. And here this is a great moment because we see Hayden kind of sticking to the persona that Ilya has in the league of being an asshole. And it's the first time Shane outwardly defends Ilya. He tells Hayden he's not a bad guy, it's mostly an act, and Hayden says a pretty convincing one. And in the books, Shane almost says, well, we all have secrets, but he stops himself. And instead, they just say, let's make sure we win this one. Important context from the books is that Ilya, we switch to his POV, and he very much expresses how much he loves playing against Shane. During one of their phone calls while he was in Russia, they talk about not caring what people say, and Shane says, bullshit, you love the awards, you love the press and the fans, you love beating me. And Ilya corrects him and says, I love beating everyone, but yes, you the most. When Shane asks him why, he shrugs and says, because you are the best. One of the things I pointed out in my breakdown of the montage from the last episode, one thing that was highlighted in the montage from the last episode is that over time, both Shane and Ilya were starting to become distractions for one another, but it wasn't until quite recently that they were distracting each other professionally. This face-off, we've seen multiple times them facing off against each other before, but this time it's different because we just watched the All-Star game. We know that their dynamic has changed. Doing this stick tap is very flirtatious and suggestive, but it does happen in hockey, and I love how they look at each other here. This shot reaffirms what I talked about in my other video about how the black and white stick tape is very much a yin and yang, how they both represent the counterweight to one another. We see that Ilya loses this face-off to Shane, and he takes the puck, regroups in the neutral zone, and starts skating away. And I love how this is shot because we see their faces, but the strength of their skating is the stand-ins. In the book, they kind of battle back and forth. Ilya takes the puck away, Shane takes it back from him, but I like how this is a little more clear-cut. Shane dipsy-doos around Ilya and goes through the neutral zone. The fact that he would ever look behind him during a game is so outrageous that it's meant to be an unavoidable truth that Ilya has now completely distracted Shane in hockey. So he gets completely blindsided by Marlowe here. And in the book, Ilya says it happened so fast he could barely process it. The book also has him be hit into the boards, whereas this is an open ice hit, arguably much, much worse. And as described, Shane is crumpled and motionless on the ice, and Ilya didn't know what to do. Now, the most realistic thing about all of this is that Hayden Pike would immediately pick a fight with Marlowe. Normally, after something like this, everybody would be getting into a scrum, so we do see that on the screen. And again, I love that they changed the aspect ratio so that we're watching it from the broadcast, and we can see here that Ilya is looming over Shane, looking very concerned, won't leave his side. In the long game book, Shane actually rewatches this on the TV with Ilya, and he says, how could nobody not know that we were in love with each other after watching that? In actuality, the broadcast would not be following Shane getting put on the stretcher or Ilya's face. They usually try not to show that. And the dialogue in this scene has been changed for the show, but I actually really like the change here. Do I think Shane would automatically have two black eyes after getting hit like that? No, but we're going for the drama here. In the book, we're in Shane's POV, and he hears his last name Hollander in a different voice. He calls out Ilya and then questions, did I say that? And he can hear Ilya saying, is he all right? Shane tries to tell Ilya, I'm okay. And the refs would be telling Ilya, go to your bench, please stand back. This is when in the books, Shane says, we're not alone. Ilya, they can see us. That line of dialogue in the books implies that he's not worried about the injury, he's worried about them being seen. His priority is them concealing their relationship. He hears Ilya say, is he all right? And then Shane says, tell him I'm fine. So he's trying to manage Ilya's worry. In the show, we hear Ilya say, is he okay? Effing tell me. Which his emotion is very much on display here. And then the broadcasters, the audio from them kind of sets more context to the scene. They say what you will about this rivalry. These two guys have played against each other. It fades out, fades back in. And they say obviously a lot of admiration there. And both in the books and in the show, Shane brings up his parents. Key difference is that after Shane says, tell him I'm fine, I'm okay, he adds the line, he's gonna worry. Which means in this moment, Shane's more worried about Ilya's feelings than he is about them being seen. When Shane says, not him, Ilya, after the medic says the coach is calling your dad, that also says to us that Shane's hierarchy of importance has now flipped from his parents first to Ilya first. Shane's first instinct is Ilya, and Ilya's is Shane. In the book, in Shane's head, he is thinking about Ilya wishing he could text him, tell him that he wiggled his toes. He couldn't remember if the game was almost over. He thought it had been the third period. He wonders what if I can't play in the playoffs, and he knows that he had been 2 goals ahead of Ilya in the scoring race. He has all these thoughts whipping around in his head as he gets rolled into the hospital. Ilya, in the meantime, in his POV in the books, is waiting until morning to go to the hospital. He only has 2 hours before Boston is leaving for the airport, and he's angry at Cliff. What I love about how this scene is shot and filmed is that Shane is a very hyper-conscious person. What I mean by that is that he's very much aware of all of his mannerisms. He overthinks every word, and this is the only time that we see him completely unfiltered, and it matches Ilya's concern here. His face is so worried, and I do think this is one of Connor Story's strongest scenes in the whole show. In the book, he says he really wanted to touch him just to know that he was really, really okay, that he had barely slept the night before, up all night sick with worry, refreshing sports sites to see if he could find any news, and he couldn't close his eyes without seeing Shane's unmoving body on the ice. This face here does such a wonderful job of conveying all of those emotions. This is the face of someone who was scared to death, and he says as much to Shane. You can tell that just laying eyes on him is giving him more comfort than he's had in hours. He asks Shane if he's okay, and Shane explains that he has a fractured collarbone and a concussion, and on the screen over his shoulder you can see what his heart rate is. I love that they use that as a narrative device in the scene because it will go down and it will reach 81, which is Ilya's number. When Shane smiles at Ilya, Ilya in the book says he knows he was happy to see him. And all this dialogue is pulled pretty much straight from the source material about it could have been worse, Marlowe feels really bad. And as a hockey player, I did like the inclusion of the line, we all get our bell rung eventually, right? Because that is something that is said. At this moment, Ilya thinks to himself that Shane must be on some good drugs because he's actually grinning. And in the book, Shane says he probably doesn't want to meet my mom in a dark alley though. She's out for blood. And Ilya says, I will warn him. Ilya's want to touch him in that moment must have been showing in his eyes because that's when Shane reaches out his hand and says, hey. And as he reaches out, you can see again that the number on the screen is starting to go down. Hudson Williams said in an interview that Shane being in this state has an element of him wanting to melt into Ilya when he sees him. And I love how quickly Ilya rushes over to the bed, and when he holds Shane's hand, you can see the blue and orange colors going on here, which again, throughout the show, and Shane says, yes, better. To me, this is a callback to Rose asking him, was it better? Well, now we can see, yes, it is better. I also love the dichotomy of Shane's face looking so relaxed and Ilya's being still so pained when he says, you scared me. And he does the eye tracking that I've talked about in previous videos. When Shane starts to offer an apology for not reaching out to him last night, Ilya quickly shuts it down because that's not what's important here. He's only concerned with Shane's well-being. And in the book, Ilya's hands go into Shane's hair, but here he traces his thumb over his freckles, which I absolutely loved. And Shane says to him, I was excited about last night. I am mad at Marlowe for fucking that up. Because again, in the books, he's already invited Ilya to the cottage. In the show, this is the first time. And in the book, he says, when will we get the chance again? And Ilya wants to say to him, I'll move into your apartment and take care of you during the playoff and read your boring hockey books and stay with you while you recover. But he doesn't. But I really like how this goes because this is such a Shane thing to do, to have pre-planned an entire conversation in his head before it happens. I think that's also insight into why he panics so much when his dad discovers him and Ilya, because he isn't able to pre-plan that conversation. And Ilya at that point had been resolved to try and end things with Shane. So when he brings up wanting to talk the night before, Ilya has this sinking feeling because he had planned to talk to him too. And in the book, he says it wasn't thrilling for him anymore, it was torture. Maybe it's better if you just rest now is his way of kind of diverting away from this because it's too painful for him. And that's when Shane says, will you come to my cottage this summer? This delivery is just so childlike and hopeful and innocent and pure and sweet. And it's also longer than the dialogue in the book version. And I love the inclusion of don't go to Russia, come to my house. And he's future planning, and Ilya can't imagine spending that much time alone with Shane if he ever wanted to be free of this horrible pain that he's in. So he tries to downplay it, and Ilya knows that he should just say no. In the book, Shane says, haven't you ever wanted more time? In the show, Shane says we could have a week or even 2. And in his lunch with his parents, he had said earlier that he only gets 2 weeks off total per year. So he's putting out there that he wants to spend it exclusively with Ilya. And Connor Story's eyes in this scene are so incredibly mesmerizing and brilliant, because in the books, Ilya is hearing these words and thinking to himself that it sounds so perfect. And looking at Shane, he knows that his heart would shatter if Ilya said no. In the show, when Shane says we could be completely alone, and then he whispers the softest together, it's so endearing and sweet, but also similar to the genetic line. And that is when Ilya's brow softens a little bit, but he takes the coward's way out by saying maybe, because he can't bear to hurt Shane's feelings, and that gives Shane so much hope. This moment in the scene feels very much like how they shoot comedies, where the camera pans quickly for the first time in the entire series. Most of the time, the only time the camera moves is very slightly or to pan in or out. And the line delivery is like a comedy because we hear Shane say, "Oh no," but hold the camera on the nurse. The line, "You're not trying to smother him with a pillow, Mr. Rosanov," is also from the book. And again, that quick, rapid pan back to Ilya's face is very much like comedy. And he plays into the joke by saying, "But good thinking," and looks at Shane and then declares, "But no, I'm just leaving." And you hear Shane say the weakest little "okay," and then a quick bye-bye. And Ilya is still so scared to leave him, doesn't want to leave him, knows it's going to be painful, so he whispers under his breath, "Bye." And this is the only time Shane kind of puts a mask back on, when he tries to put an adult voice back on and say, "See you next season," as if they are more formal, which makes Ilya laugh just the tiniest little bit. "See you next season" is the words that they say to each other, and then he's all business when he says, "Thank you, I appreciate it." So again, we already know their emotional shorthand, so "see you next season" is kind of an inside note for them. Ilya turning and walking towards the door but shushing Shane as he leaves is such another great example of them inserting comedy here. And in the book, Ilya notes he left the hospital room of the man he loved and forced himself to focus on winning the Stanley Cup. After the scene between Shane and Ilya in the hospital room, we jump ahead to May 2017, which is the playoffs. In the books, Shane and Rose text one another, but I really like that the show includes an actual phone conversation between the two of them and then expands upon the conversation that they had in the book. It comes on the heels of Shane's mother bringing up Rose Landry at the very moment that Shane is thinking to himself that he is completely in love with Ilya, which Shane feels like is a sign. He tells his mom that she had texted him when he got hurt, and his mom looks pleased by that. So again, it implies in the books that Una is trying to see if Shane is interested in Rose, and Shane defends himself and says, "No, it's our schedules. It would be hard to make it work, but that's not the reason." And she says, "When the right one comes along, you'll know." And Shane chickens out in that moment and does not tell his mother about Ilya. He just says, "Yeah, I know," and then has this ridiculous urge to text Ilya and just say, "I love you." And instead, he texts Rose. So in the show, the general premise of the text conversation is followed here because in that conversation in the book, she's encouraging him to come out to his parents. But I also think it's a great way of showing us that she made good on her word. They're planning on getting together over Labor Day, and that's really important. In the book, when Shane's watching the playoffs with his mom and she says Rosanov is hurt, he's reflecting on what's going on with him and Ilya because they haven't been talking as often as they'd like since it's the playoffs. And Shane feels bad because he should be helping his team and instead he's recovering at his parents' house in Ottawa. I love this Steadicam shot and also that we get this sweeping view to kind of get an insight into his parents' cottage and where he loves to be and what it looks like. And the nod to Una being a witch for predicting that Scott Hunter and the Admirals are going to win the cup, that plays on the heels of how Svetlana's hockey knowledge is framed in the show. It's kind of a on-the-nose way of pointing out how a lot of women in hockey are treated. Ilya's team loses, and I love the insertion of this conversation between Shane and Ilya over text. It directly kind of offsets what he's thinking about in the book, which is that they should end this because it's the sensible thing to do. He knows there couldn't be a future with Ilya, there couldn't really be a present with Ilya, and he's feeling really sad reflecting on that as he watches Ilya's season end. The show takes a more hopeful approach where the two of them are conversing right after the game. And again, I love that in the text messages you can see that Shane doesn't hesitate when sending anything anymore. Their texts are flying back and forth. It's also really satisfying that the noise of the keys clicking lines up with how quickly the text shows up on the screen. And again, the show does such a great job of establishing that kind of shorthand between Shane and Ilya because there's inside jokes mixed into this conversation that we as the viewers understand and catch on to. I also really like that at his home in the background there's classical music playing. We see Una being a very attentive parent, even though he is a grown adult boy, which he points out to her. You really get an idea of what the cottage feels like for Shane and then can predict what Ilya being a part of that might look and feel like. On the whole, though, this scene sets up so many narrative payoffs for the finale, like Yuna saying she hates Ilya a little less after he visited Shane in the hospital. We see pictures of Shane when he was little all over this house, so that pays off the book concept of Ilya wanting to see Shane's actual bedroom. We know that Ilya's ribs are hurt, so when Shane carries his bag in, that makes sense. We circle back to Ilya calling Shane boring again, which will come up multiple times in the finale episode and really kickstarted their relationship. So by the time the Stanley Cup final shows up, Ilya has been sitting at home alone in his home in Boston, mulling over the fact that if it wasn't impossible, he would already be on his way to Ontario. And he's thinking to himself, maybe my goal for next year should be to forget about Shane, find a woman, keep myself busy until the playoffs. The two of them had every intention of ending things, but were prolonging reality by pretending they were friends or whatever. It's the perfect setup for how this episode ends. The final scene in episode 5 is one of the best pieces of montage work I've ever seen because it's doing multiple kinds of storytelling at once, and they're all working in tandem for a payoff that feels earned. We see that Shane is watching the game at home with his family, and then we jump to Ilya, and he is surrounded by Svetlana and some friends. But in the book, he's actually alone in Boston, bored, and actively trying to forget Shane. And I think this is crucial because the show isn't saying that Ilya has no one. It's more of him being lonely even when around other people, which I think is foreshadowing for the long game. And almost immediately in this scene, we get a very technical way of storytelling shown to us. Shane and Ilya texting lets us move between their two spaces, and it also ties them together even though they're in separate edits. Then both of them are watching the game on their TVs, and that is what connects them to Scott and Kip, who are inside of the actual rink. In this first text exchange, we can see that Shane is lying to his mom by saying that he's texting with Hayden. So there's still an element of secrecy in his texts with Ilya. Meanwhile, Ilya is very candid when he says, "I'm irritated." And again, I think that's a callback to the books where he is really agitated about the whole situation, trying to figure out how he can forget Shane. And in the book, he acknowledges that if it existed and it wasn't the worst idea in the world, he would already have been on his way to Shane's cottage in Ontario. When New York wins, we can see that they were playing San Francisco and that Yuna was correct because she predicted they would win. This scene uses the commentators as a way to kind of structure the scene narratively as well. They point out that the Admirals won with 82 regular season games and 23 playoff performances, which means they were likely one of the top seeds, got home ice advantage, and then had 6 or 7 game series. So it definitely wouldn't have been an easy path for them to win the cup. But much of their commentary is highlighting things like time running out and love being part of the victory with the families on the ice. So again, they're kind of steering the emotional ship here. We see Ilya put his phone in his pocket and leave to walk into the kitchen, and that's when we get our first cut down to the ice. And Scott is not the focus of the scene, so to speak. He's more of just a catalyst for what comes after it. But because episode 3 was done so well, we have all of the context we need in order for everything happening in this moment to land with us narratively. Scott's face here is very diplomatic and businesslike, and he shakes the hand of what's likely the commissioner and then looks at the cameras towards his teammates, but not really at the man himself. One of the unspoken rules about winning the Stanley Cup is that you do not touch it before you've won it. In fact, a lot of players will refuse to touch the conference championship trophies because it's jinxing the Stanley Cup, and only people who have won are allowed to hoist it above their heads. Hockey has a lot of tradition and respect and superstition, so this shot here on the Jumbotron is kind of an ode to that, although normally the player's hand is on the actual cup part of the trophy. And him kissing the trophy in this way and skating around the rink to celebrate that victory with the fans is all very true to how it looks when a team wins the Stanley Cup. In the crowd, in the same seats we know are Scott's, we see Kip, his father, and Elena, and they're clapping, but Kip is crying. I really love there's a slow synth piano playing in the background here, and Kip takes a deep breath watching Scott skate around below him, and when he skates away, Elena tells him, hey, "Are you okay?" And Kip says, "I'm not sad." But she reassures him that he's allowed to be. That's one of the key elements of what this scene is touching upon, is that these guys are all celebrating with their loved ones, and both Scott and Kip would not be able to do that because they are hiding their relationship. We see Scott give the cup to Carter Vaughn, who is an assistant on this team, and this is how the tradition goes. Every member of the team has their moment to hoist the cup, and we get that quick shot of the coverage on Ilya's TV inside his house, and that's where we can insert the broadcaster saying that Vaughn takes it from Hunter. He was drafted 6 years ago. It's at this moment that we hear the first notes of "I'll Believe in Anything" by Wolf Parade, and the drum kick kind of makes it sound like it's playing inside the rink at first, but we already are associating that song with Scott and Kip thanks to episode 3. Then the camera work implements this spinning movement, and we see all the players going to greet their family and loved ones and kids, and we know already from episode 3 that Scott does not have any family there. When the lyrics say, "Give me your eyes, I need sunshine," that is when he searches for Kip's eyes in the stands. Because Kip, as we know from episode 3, is Scott's sunshine. He knows where Kip is sitting. We cut to the crowd and we see him with Elena looking at him. We pan back to Scott just as the lyrics say, "Your blood, your bones, your voice." And we see Scott considering his next move here as we zoom in closer to imply that this is a very private moment. We then leave the rink and go back into Ilya's house, where the commentators are saying, "Winning the show is getting to bring the people you love out onto the ice." And Ilya is carrying what looks like his headphones towards the couch, and Svetlana says, "For your niece, don't forget," as he puts them down. This is meant to show us that he had been planning on returning to Russia for the summer and turning Shane's invitation down, and also that he's been trying to maintain a relationship with his niece. He tells Svetlana put them in the suitcase because, again, Ilya is resolved to leave Boston and go home to Russia, so he's cranky, and Svetlana being annoyed is a way to showcase that. The voiceover is an incredible scene down here as the cup is passed around, and Ilya turns when they say Hunter seems to be looking out to the fans, no doubt a recognition for them sticking with him. That's a callback to the Man in the Crease podcast saying he typically falls apart midway through the season, and this season the fans would have believed in him. And then we go back into the rink to be with Scott and Kip in person for this moment. The lyrics say, "But I'll believe in anything and you'll believe in anything," right as Scott and Kip lock eyes. And I love his dad's face here because he's realizing Scott is looking at him and Elena too, and Kip's smile kind of falls. Svetlana getting up from the couch gives us the sense of continuity that these things are happening concurrently, and she looks at the screen and furrows her brows before walking away. By this point, Ilya is fully turned towards the TV, and we start to zoom in on his face, and it's really stoic again before we cut back to Shane, who's also watching and confused. The lyrics carry on saying, "I'll believe in anything and you'll believe in anything," which is true. I don't think either of them do believe that this could ever happen in the league, even though their ears and eyes have perked up. They very much can't believe what they're seeing. So when we go back through Shane's TV to the ice, we can see Scott throwing this claw-like hand gesture to get Kip to come down. And Elena and Kip's dad are smiling at him with pride, but Kip clearly can't believe it. So Scott has to say, "Yeah, you come," which is so out of character for him. And Elena is the final push he needs because she says go, and I just love how her reaction is literally that this is such a no-brainer and not a big deal, because that's what ultimately this story is about. It shouldn't be a big deal that Kip be on the ice with his partner when he's just won the cup. Then the lyrics change to "If I could get the fire out from the wire," and Scott looks back behind him to see if anyone's paying attention, and then they change to "I'd share a life and you'd share a life." And in Ilya's living room, the broadcast narrates, "Is that a fan?" Big moment for that fan if true. So throughout this moment, Ilya is moving things around, walking back and forth, and this is the first time we see him actually pause and go to sit down to watch what's happening. And it's presumably been a few minutes since he and Shane were texting, so you can see his phone in his hands here as he sits down. The lyrics continue as Kip starts to walk down the row and towards the stairs, and then he waits at the top, and he only descends when the lyrics say, "I'd take you where nobody knows you." This whole thing is timed so that Kip gets out there in line with the bridge. So yes, it seems like he's taking a long time, but that is totally purposeful. This is when Ilya gets his phone out while the camera zooms in closer on his face for the first time, and he sends Shane a text, "What is he doing?" right as the lyrics say, "and nobody gives a damn." Then he looks back up at the screen, and his face here is perfect because he's clearly curious and serious. Then we cut to the side of Shane, so we get to see Yuna looking at the TV beside him, and Shane says, "I don't know." We see Yuna look at David, who's entering the living room at the same time, holding her drink, and he looks at the TV confused too. This is when Shane leans forward onto his knees to get closer to the screen as the lyrics say, "I said nobody knows you." Then on TV we see Kip walking down the steps right as they say, "and nobody gives a damn," which is a perfect overlap because back in Ilya's apartment we see all of his Russian friends drinking on the couch as though they don't really give a damn what's going on because Ilya's the only one zeroed in. I love that we can see his Slavic house shoes on. And the broadcasters say, "Hunter now trying to get someone's attention," before we cut back to an up close on Ilya's face. And I love how his eyes moved back and forth there to indicate that his brain is starting to move faster as he's processing what might be happening. When Kip gets over to the bench, this really would not be allowed during a cup final game, but in the show, the opening here allows Kip to jump over to get onto the bench, and he looks unsure. And yes, he took his sweet ass time to get down there, but this again has to line up with the bridge of the song. But he's also not sure what's happening because Scott doesn't do this. This was not discussed. And that's when the drum kick starts to happen, which lets us, the viewer, know that they're building towards something here. And in Ilya's house, the broadcasters point out he just hopped the boards, and we can see that Ilya is watching Scott grab Kip's hand and turn. When we're back in their POV, Kip says, "You don't have to do this," which, if you watch my breakdown of episode 3, is a narrative callback because Kip says different versions of this throughout the early stages of their relationship, and Scott saying, "Yes, yes, I do," is huge here. And it's right as the lyrics say, "I could give you my apology by handing over all the olive trees." This is Scott apologizing and extending an olive branch. Ilya's face grows more serious, and we move behind him so that we can see exactly what he is watching on screen, which is Scott pulling Kip into the middle of the ice by his hand to be very visible. And when we switch back to Shane, he's leaning even further towards the TV with his mouth open as the lyrics say, "I could take away the shaky knees," which is something very indicative of Shane. He's definitely the more nervous one. We see what he's watching on TV while the lyrics repeat, "and I could give you all the olive trees." And you can see Scott and Kip talking but not hear what they're saying, and Ilya is locked in on his screen. His face has not changed for minutes now, watching Scott, smiling at Kip and talking to him. So then the show finally puts us back on the ice with Scott and Kip so that we can hear what is being said. The lyrics are, "and look for a place far away from here," right as Scott smiles and kisses Kip right in front of everyone while the bridge starts. And the camera swoops around from left to right behind them with the overhead lights flashing like sunshine. And the line, "So give me your eyes," when they look at each other. We get this wide of Shane and his parents. And then my favorite shot, arguably of the series, is this one here of Ilya. The show takes a book metaphor of Ilya feeling like he was watching all the worst things about his life getting sucked up by a tornado, and the show gives us that motion. Scott and Kip have been panning left to right, and Ilya now is panning right to left. It is the most beautiful visual storytelling. Then again, we spin left to right with them, just as the lyrics say, "Give me your eye, I need sunshine," and the camera doesn't stop moving as they tell each other they love each other. And it follows Shane here, and this is when the crowd noise is brought back in. So we were just in Scott, Kip, Shane, and Ilya's worlds for a moment. Now we're filtering the rest of the world back in audibly. So we hear the crowd, we hear "oh wow" from Yuna, we hear "you don't see that every day" from the broadcaster, pretty big night for hockey, the crowd cheering them on. Then we start getting cameras on them from opposite angles, the crowd cheering while Scott and Kip smile so happily at one another. And as the announcer says, "Listen to the crowd, they're loving this," Ilya shoots up from the couch with urgency, matching the tempo of the song, and his body turns before his head, which I think is so important because it highlights a difference between him and Shane. He has immediate movement, urgency, no hesitation to call him, and he does. He gets up and he calls Shane right away. Whereas Shane, we've seen him frozen with his mouth open, unable to move. So this would only happen if Ilya is the one who makes the phone call. The announcer says, "Good for Scott Hunter," and then we break to a wide shot, and David is already looking at Shane in this moment. When he gets up, we can see that Scott and Kip are still on the TV, and Shane waits until he rounds the couch to answer his phone, but he doesn't say anything until he gets outside of the room. I do think that this adds some foreshadowing to maybe Una and David knowing that Shane might be gay, the reaction here. When Shane smiles and says, "What the?" Ilya cuts him off. He's so urgent to say this and says, "I'm coming to the cottage." Words heard around the world. He leaves zero room for misunderstanding, no hesitation. He was calling to say those 5 words only to Shane. And this shot is so beautiful. It's got that yellow warm coloring to it. His face is so stoic. He has a reflection opposite him here. He's sliced and propped in a way we've seen him multiple times before. He looks resolved to make this trip happen, and he's demanding it almost. Shane's face is like pure elation, and we just hear a wordless, not even fully formed before the show cuts the scene to black and cuts the sound out with it, which they do so incredibly well in this show because nothing needs to be said. That pause is respect for the moment. We know in that one moment that Ilya has chosen Shane.